it's Ciervo again, and we're continuing on with the Gospel of John. Remember, you can send me questions or anything else that you would like concerning anything I say or don't say for that matter. I want to just give you a little bit of a background, and here's the chart that I put up there concerning the outline of the Book of Signs. And we're just coming to the end of the prologue, and from there we'll jump on into look at the first disciples, and then go on into some of the more salient points. But it's not that this portion is not exciting either. I'm trying to keep the time down. I'm noticing that YouTube doesn't like when you go over a certain amount of time. Usually it's 20 minutes. I've got these recording at I think 480p, which is, for any other medium really wouldn't be very good at all. But we're looking at this in a different way. So let me read to you what it says here in John chapter 1 and verse 6. There came a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify about the light, so that all might believe through him. Now remember, just stop right here. Remember, going back to John chapter 20, John rather says that he put these signs in this book so that we might believe that Jesus is a Christ. And so here it is again, so that all might believe through him. So John is a witness. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. There was the true light, which coming into the world enlightens every man. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even those who believe in his name, who were born not of who were born not of blood, nor the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. And that is a mouthful just to deal with today. And we'll see that, John came as a witness. And again, that word witness is really an important word. If, again, you go back through the Gospel of John and you look at someone who gives testimony, or someone who witnesses, this is a very important word to that first century church, and really the first century people. A witness was someone who was very important. Let me just say it that way. And it tells us that he was sent from God. And we know the story from the Gospel of Luke, who John is and how he came to be, how the angel Gabriel, who stood in the presence of God, came to John's father Zacharias in the temple, and Zacharias basically didn't believe him, and or at least intimated that he didn't believe him, and Gabriel silenced him until John was born, and until they were getting ready to circumcise him, that Elizabeth actually said his name is going to be called John. And at that, Zacharias' mouth was open. He was able to testify. But here it tells us that he was going to testify to the light so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. So right there you have, he came as a witness, and he came to testify about the light. And again, John is he's anchoring this point down, that all these people showed up to declare that Jesus was the Christ. And then he says, there was the true light, which coming into the world enlightens every man. And I love that verse, that Jesus coming into the world brings light to every person. Whether we receive that light or not is another story. And it says that he was in the world. It again repeats, the world was made through him. So this Jesus, this person, is not an angel that was made, but that the whole world was made through him, and the world didn't know him. Nobody knew him. They didn't have a relationship with him. And it says he came to his own, that is to Israel, and those who were his own, Israel didn't know him. They didn't receive him. And then he goes on, he contrasts that by saying, but as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even those who believe in his name, who are born not of blood, nor the will of flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. And John's making again a subtle insinuation that you have to be born again. You have to be born from above to become a child of God. And that it's not Israel who are children of the flesh, who can be children of the will of man, and they're not born of blood. That doesn't make you a child of God, but it really, what it takes is faith. It takes faith to become a child of God. And that's what we'll see over and over again, that this whole idea of belief, which is another way of saying trust, that we put our trust in Jesus. This is most important part of the gospel that we're looking at. Okay, I hope it's not too much of a shock. I've done more than change my shirt. This is really Thursday afternoon now, almost 1 o'clock. Things happen in the Ciervo household even when my wife isn't home, and things change rather quickly, and always looking to get something quiet. What I'd love to be able to do is have a studio set up in my basement where I have lighting and everything else that could help me do these kinds of things. Have a dedicated camera, not just a webcam, which does okay, but doesn't give you like a 4K presentation. But we'll work on it. We'll see what the Lord provides. I have a large enough basement where I can do that. I actually have a sound studio down there that I did radio programs on. But anyway, that interrupts us with the Gospel of John. And I want to continue on with the Gospel of John. And let me take these dings out. Again, I started this yesterday, Wednesday afternoon. Thought I would finish it for this morning, and things just got away. Had a couple of meetings, a couple of things to do. Wednesday turned out to be a pretty busy day. So now we're coming back, and I wanted to finish up some of this prologue so that we could see where it goes and what it lays out for us, because it is the beginning, and I know we've spent four sessions on this without too much rambling going on, but we want to look and see how John is laying this out for us in introducing Jesus to us as the Messiah. Okay, so sorry for the glitches in the sound. I'm not sure what causes that. Using microphones that Camtasia suggests to use, and also cameras that they suggest to use. That's a little bit of our technical difficulties. Every once in a while, they seem to just throw that glitch in for us. But if we were going to continue on, which we are, and look at this scripture. And this is verse 14 of chapter 1. I think this is one of the pivotal verses, and certainly one that calls our attention to Jesus. John writes, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory, glory as the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified about him and cried out, saying, 'This was he of whom I said, He who comes after me has a higher rank than I, for he existed before me. For of his fullness we have all received, and grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ. No one has seen God at any time, the only begotten God, who is in the bosom of the Father. He has explained him.'" And there are a number of things in that passage that are just really, we don't have the time today. I think when you start to mine these things out, you just see how great they really truly are. There's just some beautiful passages there. that we could look at. Just this first one that says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." Let's stop right there, because it tells us that God became human. God came down and dwelt among us. And those of you who have done any studying, or if you've listened to a good preacher, the word becoming flesh is what we call the incarnation. That's incarnate is actually a Latin expression, and it literally means to become flesh or to become meat, to be embodied. Incarnate, carne is the word, if you understand Spanish. Carne is the word for meat, and incarnation in Latin is that he has become flesh. That's how we translate it in the Greek. Obviously, it says it differently, but tells us about Jesus coming down to earth and being with us. And then John does one of his references to the Old Testament. The New American Standard says, "and dwelt among us." And that word dwelt, some translations use the word remain, or actually, if I could just get in there without umming and ahhing about it, it says dwelt is the word tabernacled, that he tabernacled among us. He made his home, he tented among us. And John's referring here to the Old Testament, where God lived among his people in the tabernacle in the wilderness. And that's the first reference we have of Jesus really fulfilling something that we see in the Old Testament, that Paul said it happened to them so that we could be instructed. And here John is using it. And again, John uses Old Testament imagery and Judaistic ideas throughout his gospel, which again leads me to believe that he's talking to someone who understands some things in the Old Testament, perhaps not understanding Hebrew, but understanding some of these things in the Old Testament. But he tells us that Jesus dwelt among us, and we saw his glory. Glory as the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. And there are sermons, there are volumes that you could preach out of these verses. The same way Israel saw the glory of God in a fire by night, pillar of cloud by day, they saw the glory of God right there. They saw the glory of God up on Mount Sinai, though they wouldn't go near to it. It was encased in a cloud. But he says here, we saw him as the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, that word begotten causes a lot of trouble for a lot of people, and I'll give you the Cliff Notes version of what I think it means. I think he's talking about Jesus being the incarnate Son of God, that he is God in the flesh. And that's how he is begotten, because the Son of God, or God the Son, the second person of the Trinity, was never begotten, was never obtained, never came into existence, but has always been in existence. And so I believe he's talking about Jesus being the true begotten Son of God, being now in the bosom of the Father, which he gets into. And he tells us that he is full of grace and truth. And those two words are the words that we ought to always remember are part of our gospel message, that they are both grace and truth. We share grace, but it is the truth. That is, that it's that which corresponds to what's real. And that is the message that we get from seeing or reading these verses. And then he goes on and he refers, now watch, he goes back to John the Baptist. And he says, John testified about him and cried out, saying, this was he of whom I said, he who comes after me has a higher rank than I, for he existed before me. He had being before I had being. Even though Jesus was biologically younger than John. Remember, Elizabeth is pregnant with John the Baptist. We get that from Luke's gospel, when Mary goes and sees Elizabeth, and when when she sees Elizabeth, Elizabeth says, "When I heard your voice, the baby leapt in my womb." And so we see that he's talking about Jesus's existence as God the Son before John was ever alive. And again, this is something else that will be repeated again through the Gospel of John. John will go out there, and it's interesting how John will say things about Jesus or say things about a person before they do it. Like he introduces Mary, who is the sister of Lazarus, that she's the one who washed Jesus's feet. But in the gospel, you'll notice that it's before Mary ever does it. But he's introducing people. And if I could say this about the Gospel of John especially, but again, he's seen the race already. He knows who the winner is. He already knows the things that are important for us to understand. And so John's Gospel is just these encounters, especially the book of signs, are encounters with people all along the way. And John wants you to see how those encounters really reveal something about Jesus to us. And so the verse goes on, he says, "For of his fullness we have all received, and grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ." So he tells us that those of us who have received Jesus, we have received grace upon grace. We have received grace to receive him, and then once we receive him, we receive more grace. And John is just being overflowing in his language, talking about who Jesus is. And he's going to make the contrast now between the Old and the New Testament. How Moses represented the Old Testament, but now how Jesus represents the New Testament. And here's my giveaway again with the book of Hebrews, that you'll remember if you know the book of Hebrews, the first part of the book, a good part of the first part of the book, is comparing Jesus with Old Testament people and even the angelic. But he compares them to Aaron, he compares them to angels, he compares them to Moses. He goes right down the line comparing them to all these people. John does something very similar, and we'll see how that works out as we do that. But here, grace and truth came into being or were realized through Jesus Christ. He says, "No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten God, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him." And a very interesting way of putting that. So this is kind of like leaving you with a cliffhanger, but looking at that verses that no one has ever seen God except the only begotten God has seen him. That is that Jesus. And now what we're going to do is get into the whole discipleship side of Jesus and how he starts to do things so that his disciples will believe in him. And you'll see that as a repeating theme through at least the first half of the Gospel of John. And then certainly it gets more deeper, if I can say that, if that sounds right. It gets deeper when we look at Jesus' interaction with his disciples, preparing them for his departure, but also for the coming of the Lord. And, again, I mentioned, the idea of a horse race, that the commentator now is looking back on the race, and he's just including things that he wants you to know about how this all happens, how this particular horse wins the race. And if I can, I don't want to use that illustration too much, but basically the gospel writers know how it ends. They know Jesus rises from the dead, and they each include something that is beneficial for those readers to point to Jesus as the Son of God, as alive from the dead, and also being the promised one all the way from the beginning of it. I preached a sermon on the big story some years ago, and I just presented the idea of what is the big story. The big story is that God made it, we broke it, and Jesus fixed it. And he made the earth and everything in it for mankind to have a relationship with him. And we continually broke it. We broke it initially in Adam and Eve, paying the consequences for their sin. But each of us also has initially broken that, even though we bear the responsibility for our humanity and our defiance of God, rebellion against God. And what we see throughout the Gospels, rather throughout the Bible, is God's promise to us that he's going to restore it. And that comes to fruition, to maturation, to maturity in the revelation of who Jesus Christ is. And that's what we see. We begin to see now in the Gospel of John. And you'll see that the rest of this chapter is really devoted to Jesus' first encounter with his disciples. At least at this point, we see him relating to his disciples, and we get an idea of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. What does God expect of us to be real disciples of Jesus? So until next time, if you want to read on, read into the end of this chapter, think about it, and see when I talk again tomorrow, put this up tomorrow, we'll see how God has given us expectations for us, what he expects of us to be disciples of Jesus Christ and follow him and apprehend this new life through trusting in Jesus Christ.